Good afternoon. I'm quite humbled and delighted to be here, and I'd like to thank your educators for inviting me. I really do appreciate this, and it's something that I feel at this point in my career I love to give back. But I'm here to hopefully introduce you all to the world of forensic architecture and something about what Thornton Tomasetti does that's different from other firms, especially for the construction people in here. There's different roles for different people in our firm that, not that I'm advertising for it, but my goal is to show you a different path, hopefully, in that you can do with your careers. If it's something perhaps that you hadn't thought about. So, what is forensic architecture? I'm always asked that question. Whenever I'm in a social situation, somebody will ask me, well, what do you do for a living? And I'll say, well, I'm an architect. And inevitably the next question would be, well, do you specialize in any one area? And I'd say, well, yes, I specialize in forensics. And then you'll get a dumb stare, because nobody knows what that is. And then the next question inevitably is, well, what is forensic architecture? And if I'm talking to somebody who's like just a layman and doesn't understand our industry at all, I'll say to them, well, if a traditional architect puts buildings together, I take them apart and find out what's wrong, and then generally somebody gets sued, and I'll testify as to what the issue was. So you become an expert witness. But I want to back up a little bit and tell you about my path through USM and what I did from that point forward, because for the first 28 years of my career, I was a traditional architect. And to become an expert in architecture, I think you have to walk the walk. So the fact that I did 28 years of a traditional architectural role, designing buildings, sort of puts me in a better position to be the guy who can testify as to what went wrong, or maybe an architect did something wrong, or maybe he's being sued. So we're going to go into all of that a little bit, but first I want to show you a little bit about, this was your college, and this is that guy with all that hair who was at this school. And that's in the technology building when it was brand new. So that's me with hair. And that's the hub, and look at all those cars in the late 1970s, okay? So I thought we'd lighten it up here. But here's what I would like you to take away from this today and the areas that I'm going to discuss. So the first thing I'm going to discuss is my path through Southern to becoming a registered architect with only a 4-year degree. I'm going to try to minimize this a little bit because I'm not sure that that path is open to any of you here today. But let me ask you a question. How many are in the architectural program? Raise your hand. Okay, and how many are in construction technology? Okay, so it's about an even mix, right? I'm sorry? Oh, we have interior designers as well? How many are in that program? Okay, great. Great, good to see you all. So I want to talk to you about being a registered architect and getting through and how I did it. It was quite a battle. It had many ups and downs, and it was very trying for me. And then I'm going to talk to you about my present employer, Thornton Tomasetti, and what we do, where we are. And then I'm going to go into a forensic study or a case that I worked on that was a $100 million lawsuit, and some of the things that were thrown at me and how I solved the puzzle, and my team solved it a little bit. Now, I can't get too far into that, unfortunately, because it's a very lengthy process, so I'm going to pick on certain aspects of the project that I think will be helpful to you. So, I came here in 1979 and stayed here and got my degree in 1983. I always wanted to be an architect and knew that one way or another, whether I was going to go get a master's degree or whether I was going to try an alternative path, I wanted to become a licensed architect, so that was my goal. I'm from New Jersey. I grew up in New Jersey. I had never been to Mississippi before at this time. What you did back then, there was no internet. I looked at schools to go to when I was a kid. I was 21 years old when I started here. There were two schools in New Jersey that offered architecture. One was Princeton University. That was not for me, and nor could I afford it. And the other was New Jersey Institute of Technology. And New Jersey Institute of Technology was located in Newark, New Jersey. Anybody ever been to Newark, New Jersey? Yuck. Right? I mean, I don't mean to disparage my state, but I didn't want to go to school in Newark, New Jersey. And, so I started to look outside of New Jersey and found USM. So you buy this big book, you get all the statistics about it, and I loved the look of the campus. I thought it was a beautiful campus. It still is today. And I thought, that's where I want to go to school. So I applied, I got in, and started my career here. I did my 4 years. It was wonderful. I lived in Bond Hall. I was a 21-year-old freshman living in Bond Hall, which was a dorm at the time. I understand it's not today. I met my roommate first day. He was the only guy I had met or known in Mississippi. And guess what? We're still friends today. I had dinner with him last night. So, yeah, I think that's wonderful. So you forge friendships in college. That's what college is about. It's part of what college is about anyway. So the program here was probably different from what you went through, but honestly, it was more technical, I think, back then, and that's what I liked. I was a nuts and bolts kind of guy. I wasn't a design architect, was never going to be a design architect. So for me, it was perfect, and I really liked the program. Well, let me ask you something. Do you guys have one of those dreaded classes? What's the dreaded class today?
Better not say.
Can't share.
Can't say?
Faculty are in here.
Well, for us, it was structures. Okay? House structures. All right? We had a professor who was a structural engineer, didn't care much for the architectural students, was a little partial to the construction guys, but he was tough. And everybody dreaded that class, but you had to go through it. So when you go through a tough class like that, you think, oh, I'm never going to do that again. I'm never going to use that stuff. All right? Well, I get out of school, and it was 1983. It was a recession. There really weren't many jobs to be had. So I left Hattiesburg along with probably 75% of my classmates and went back home. None of us had jobs. Maybe 25% of the people got jobs. It was just a tough time. So I got home and kept applying or sending out resumes to you'd read the newspaper, you'd circle the architectural jobs, you'd try to get a job. There were none to be had. So I worked the summer being a carpenter. I was a framer on a framing crew. So here I am with a college degree, banging nails for $5 an hour. It was a little disheartening. But again, you take away these experiences and you learn from them. And look, I knew that it wasn't going to be my career, so it was just a temporary stop. But you take your education and that field work. I would recommend any of you go work in the field for a few months. It's a wonderful experience. You'll get abused. You'll be the college boy and girl, and you'll take the abuse. But you know what? You learn how things go together. And it was really, really an eye-opener for me, and I learned a lot very quickly. So I get an interview one day from a company that was about 20 minutes from my house, an architectural and engineering firm. They were small. And I go into the interview, and the guy asked me, well, what are you doing now? And I said, I'm banging nails. He said, that's great. I said, what do you mean that's great? He says, well, we do all wood frame construction here. We do multifamily housing that's wood frame. So can you apply that experience, what you learn in the field, and put it on paper? I said, sure I can. And he says, then can you calculate all that stuff? And I thought back to Dr. Covington's structures class and said, yeah, I can. So you use what you learn. You never think you're going to use it again, but some of the things that you learn in school, you're going to use again. Believe me. So anyway, I went to work for that firm. I was the 23rd person hired by that firm. They did multifamily housing. They did civil engineering, planning, architecture, and surveying. And it was a great experience for me. Developers would come to us with raw land, and you would start right from the beginning. You would do the planning, you would do the architecture, you'd work with the civil engineers, the grading, they would do all the underground stuff. And the reason why developers would come to us is because we were all under one roof. And we could get more residential units on the property because we were working in unison. So that was the draw. So like I said, I was the 23rd person hired by that company in 1983. And by 1987, we were up to 105 employees, which meant I got tossed into management very, very quickly. I had to learn fast. But it was a great experience. I was working 60, 70 hours a week. I was running 3 or 4 jobs. I had a staff of 22 at one point working under me. So, you take that education and you just learn on your feet. But we were college educated. We could do it. But the path I took, and I wanted to get licensed. In New Jersey at the time, and that's where my firm was, where I was working, they had a deal where if you had a 4-year degree, you could work for an architect for 5 years, and you can become eligible to take the architect's exam. So that's the path that I was on. But guess what? After I did 4 years, and I worked for 3 years, they changed the law. They changed it so that they said, no, you need the 5-year degree before you're going to get a license. So I was devastated, but I don't roll over easy. So I started writing letters to say, wait a minute, I couldn't go to school in my state. You're cutting me off from getting a license in the state where I live, and because you changed the rule in the game before I can finish the game. I said, that's not fair, and I didn't like it. So I started a letter writing campaign and made a big stink in my state. But in the meantime, I went to New York, and they had a deal where if you worked 4 years under the direction of an architect, you can become eligible to take an exam. So that's how I got my license. I went to New York, I went and took the exam, I passed, and now I'm a licensed architect, but in New York. So I went back to New Jersey and said, I have a license, give me a license. It's called reciprocity. And they didn't want to give it to me. So it was a big battle that I went through, did more letter writing. And to make a long story short, eventually they brought me in for an interview, and they called me up, and reluctantly they gave me a license. So now I had New York and New Jersey. So I wanted to share that with you because, if that's your goal, don't give up. Figure a way. There's always a way to get there. And don't let stumbling blocks stumble you. Figure it out. I just feel that it was one of the things that I did in my life that I'm glad I pursued it and kept fighting. So let me I know today there's NCARB and there's all these other, hurdles to get a license. But do any of the architectural students intend on getting a license? Is that in the plan? There are a few. Good. Go do it. I recommend it for anybody if that's your goal. Go and do it. It's quite a rewarding career. So let me tell you a little bit about, by the way, does anybody have any questions about that path or anything? Okay, so let me tell you a little about the company I work for now, which is Thornton Tomasetti. Thornton Tomasetti is a 1,500 person engineers and architectural firm that I find to be very unique. They started as a structural engineering firm, and presently we have over 50 offices throughout the world. We have projects right now in 54 different countries. We are in this area, or not. We're not in Mississippi, but we do have an office in Atlanta, Georgia. We have 3 offices in Texas. We have 3 offices in Florida. We have an office in Kansas City, and up and down the East Coast and up and down the West Coast, and a few in between. We're in Denver. We're throughout the country, strategically located. We do several different things, and they started out as a structural engineering firm, and now they do designs for super tall buildings. And any kind of really unique structural need, we're usually involved. Presently, and I'm going to show you this, well, maybe I'll show you now. These are, just sketches of some of the buildings that Thornton Tomasetti has been the structural engineer on. And if you look at them, these are the super tall buildings in the world. Some of you may, one of the buildings that I really like is Petronas Towers in Kuala Lumpur. That was one of the tallest buildings in the world at the time. It's since been exceeded, but we've been involved in every one of these. And right now, going under construction presently is the Jeddah Tower, 3,200 feet. This thing is 1,000 meters tall. I mean, think about that. This is, if you've ever been to New York, it's almost 3 times the size of the Empire State Building. It's unbelievable that they can build a building that tall. And that's presently under construction in Saudi Arabia. And it's a concrete structure, no less, too, which is another oddity. It's not steel. But anyway, so when there's a need for real heavy-duty structural engineering, we usually get the call. Presently in New York, there's a big development some of you may have heard of. It's called Hudson Yards. It has more square footage of office and retail than the entire city of San Diego. That's how big this is. And it's built over a railroad bed. And to build over an active railroad bed, I mean, it's not one track. I'm talking about 32 tracks that come into Penn Station, and this is where they would park. So they built this giant platform that was engineered by Thornton Tomasetti, where you maybe only had 2 feet between tracks, and there's trains going under here the whole time this thing is under construction. So they can't just build a grid system. They had to design this thing that there's going to be 100-story buildings on. And they only had certain spots where they can get their pilings down. So it was a very interesting engineering project. But one of the things that, I'm going to show you some parts of that just briefly, but one of the things that's opening up in March is called the Edge. This is a gigantic cantilever off about the 80th story of one of these buildings that is made of glass. And it was designed by Thornton Tomasetti. Look it up if you get a chance. I mean, you're going to be standing on glass 80 stories above the ground, and the edge, the railings, if you will, are also glass panels that go up on an angle. And this thing is wild. I really encourage you to go look at this. If you're ever in New York, go and see it. It's going to open next month. But just look it up. It's called the Edge. It's a wild, wild structure. And these are the types of things that Thornton Tomasetti gets called in on. Nothing stumps these people. Nothing. So let me go back a little bit. Oh, I'm going the wrong way. Sorry. We have 10 different, really, divisions or practices in Thornton Tomasetti. Some of these, like structural engineering, applied science, transportation, construction engineering, don't really involve us. We don't have architects working in those divisions. We don't have construction majors working in those divisions either. So I'm not going to talk as much about them, but I wanted to introduce you to some of these other areas because they are truly career paths that you all might consider. Like, I'm going to talk about renewal. I'm going to talk about resilience, which is an up-and-coming field. Protective design. I just learned today that USM has a similar program in protective design. I was really pleased to learn that. They don't really hire architects or construction people, but I do some projects with them, in conjunction with them. But let me just tell you briefly what that is. These are ex-military guys. They were actually snipers. And what they do is they'll go to like a stadium or a school or a municipal complex and look for vulnerabilities. Where if people are going to exit a stadium and you ball game's over, everybody going out this way, if somebody was going to want to do something nefarious, they're going to do it when people are exiting that building. So these guys come in, do a complete study around that city, and look for the vulnerable points. They would say if a sniper's going to set up, he's going to set up from this building or from that vantage point. So when there's an event, you need to put security people up there watching for this. Or maybe there's a vehicular path that can plow a bunch of people over. So these guys are studying these vulnerabilities. I just think it's interesting because I learned today that there's a program here similar to this. And I'm going to be telling my people that, and I'm sure we're going to put this all together at one point. So let me talk a little more about each of these areas. Okay, I told you about structural engineering and what they do. They do some crazy stuff. They do tall buildings. I'm not going to go much into it because it isn't something that would work for us. But here's that Jeddah Tower that I said is going to be 3,280 square feet, 3,280 feet tall. Look at this thing. That's a monster of a building, But think about the structural engineering about how that thing is going to move in the wind, and out of concrete, no less. Pretty cool stuff. Here, there's another one there that I admire. Come on. There's a Barclays Center in New York, which is where they play basketball, and I think they do hockey or something in there. But look at that cantilever. Look at that ring of a cantilever there. They were all stumped at how they were going to do this, and we got called in at the last minute to design that. And look at that thing. Isn't it wild? Okay, facade engineering. Anybody ever heard of facade engineering? This is an up-and-coming area where if an architect gets the commission to design tall buildings or any building, it could be a stadium. We also do stadiums. Oh, what happened? Did I move it? Okay. The architect who is designing the building obviously hires sub-consultants. He'll hire a structural engineer, he'll hire mechanical, electrical, plumbing. But the next one that he hires now is facade engineering, because these facades have gotten so complex. They're not just straight glass fronts anymore. Look at some of this stuff. They jut out, they're bubbles. Somebody has to design that. So there's a specialty of facade engineering. So if people like that, this is a line of work that's architects, but they don't need to be licensed architects. Okay? They're technical architects. They're guys that figure out how this stuff goes together, is not going to leak, is able to move properly. And they relay that to the architect of record, and he's signing off on the entire package, but he uses the facade engineers, which are really architects, as a consultant. So this is really cool stuff, and we have a great team that does this. They're not a big team, but these guys are always swamped with work, and they're always looking for people that are interested in this and that can deal with facades. It's a very specialized field, but it's a good field, and it's an up-and-coming field. So here are some of the wild facades that you might see. Look at this stuff. This isn't your everyday just put some glass in a curtain wall. It really isn't. So it's fun stuff. Let me just back up 1 second, because there's one project on here I want to show you. Okay, you see this building in the top left? That is in that Hudson Yards project that is in the west side of New York. And that's a very unique building and a one-of-a-kind building. You see that part on the right? It moves. It's a venue space. It can be an outdoor venue space or an interior venue space, depending on how you want to use it. So Thornton Tomasetti designed the kinetics that make this thing move. And so that this building can mate up. If you look at the angles there, you'll see that it'll mate up with the fixed part of the building, which is the left side of the building, and the moving part of the building. And they do all this, it doesn't leak, so you can open it up or you can close it. I know no other building that does this. So it's a really, really cool structure. So I just wanted to point that one out. That's something that we did kinetics, we did structural engineering, we did facade engineering on. Here's the Viking Stadium. We put the roof on it. I don't know if you remember, I think it was this stadium. There was a roof on the stadium that collapsed due to snow load. And they needed to fix it. They called us in, we designed a new roof for them. And again, part of our facade team is in conjunction with our structural engineers, did that. Okay, sustainability. Here's another practice that is a career path that somebody might want to consider. What these guys do, and they're generally architects, again, they're a sub-consultant to the design architects that would hire them to say, get our LEED certification. That's the easy stuff. But they do education and training in making a building more efficient. And that's a big, hot area today. Very hard to make money in business, but it's a hot area, and there's a lot of people that are very interested in sustainability. You do energy audits, you do building certifications, but most of our guys are very, very high-level architects that have a keen interest in the greening of America, making this buildings more efficient so that they don't use all the energy that that are necessary. They build their own energy. They make their own energy. They save their own water. There's lots of ways to do this, and these guys are very passionate about it. So that's another career choice that doesn't really take a license. Renewal. We have everywhere. You go downtown Hattiesburg. You go in any city, you have large buildings that always need upkeep. Any large city that has buildings higher than 5 or 6 stories generally have laws or ordinances that these facades have to be checked every 5 years for safety reasons. In New York, it used to be called Local Law 11. They call it something else now. But can you imagine a city like New York with, somebody just a couple of months ago got killed because bricks fell off of a building and hit her in the head. So what the renewal practice does is that's one of the things that they do. And for the construction guys, we hire lots of construction folks because this is very field intensive. So when the architects would design a fix, or maybe it's a historic structure, we need to know the inert materials of what was built. These guys are very in tune to the historic character of these buildings because you don't want to change that character. In some cases you can't. But we'll go up on scaffolds, they'll look for cracks, they'll look for loose bricks, they'll look for cornices that are falling off or in need of repair, and then they'll design the repair. This is a never-ending battle. Just think of the building stock throughout this country that's old and in need of repair. But, think about trying to prepare a set of documents to do this repair. You can't pinpoint every loose brick or every place that needs mortar pointing, or, maybe there's structural repairs that need to be done. It's very hard to pinpoint. So what you do is you prepare a set of documents that say, okay, we're going to do a bid for X amount of linear feet of repointing, or X amount of number of bricks. So you do unit costs. And then somebody has to monitor that you used those unit costs. That's where the construction team comes in. They're in the field saying, okay, how many linear feet of crack did they repair today? And how many brick did they put in today? So that, you just can't nail everything down in a plan. You have to have people in the field doing it and overseeing it and making sure that when that gets done, that the owner paid for specifically only what was done. And the second part of it is that what was done correctly in accordance with those contract documents and is safe. Mainly our job is safety. So renewal does a lot of stuff like that. They do mechanical, electrical, and plumbing upgrades to buildings. They do fire protection. But mostly it's envelope renewal, like I just described. They'll do roofs. They'll do new window installations. That's what the renewal team does. There are licensed architects in there, but there are a lot of people that work under them that are not licensed architects, and there are specifically construction-related people that are just the field guys. They bring the data back to the architects, and we work together. Very good field. You'll always have work. So here's some examples of some of the renewal work that we've done. If you like heights, if you like hanging off of tall buildings, you like going up on scaffold, you like strapping in, go for it. I don't. But we have guys that are on top of the Chrysler building. They're on top of the Empire State Building. We did a renewal of the Capitol Dome, which is actually made out of cast iron. So, it's these type of structures that you get to work on. These are iconic buildings that you get to work on, keeping them in shape, keeping them in good form. It's a great field. A lot of our guys are very passionate about the historic structures, and they really like working on historic buildings and studying them and getting the proper materials, even if it has to be made somewhere else. They'll go figure out how to get that piece of cornice that fell off made perfectly so that it matches historically like it was. Fun stuff. All right, here's something near and dear to my heart, which is our forensics practice. Now, I told you a little about what I would tell a layman about forensics, but there's really a lot more to forensics. Are you all familiar with the Hard Rock Cafe collapse in New Orleans, or the Hard Rock Hotel collapse under construction in New Orleans? Well, you know what was the first group called in? Our forensic team. And you know why they were called in? I mean, mostly it's the structural engineers that were called in, and really the highest level guys that we have, all the PhD structural engineers, and the reason was somebody had to come in to stabilize that building so that it wasn't going to do any more damage. So it was more the safety aspect of it. But we came in, we brought a team down there the next day, and we were right on it telling them how to stabilize this building. Now if you remember, there were 2 cranes on there as well, and they were quite a dilemma. The cranes that were on that building were in a precarious position because they were no longer properly attached to the slab edges. And what do you do with this? So these guys run calculations real quick and determine that, hey, if there was a heavy wind load that comes through here, these cranes can come down, so we need to get down quickly. So they determined a method of blasting to get the cranes out of there. So that's the extreme of what we do, and we've done others like that. There was bridge collapses. Okay, I-35 bridge in Indianapolis, I think it was Minneapolis, that collapsed some years ago and killed 8 people. We get called in to figure out what happened. Why did that bridge fail? Down in Miami, pedestrian bridge fell, and I think that one also killed 8 people. I think it was the University of Miami. It was a pedestrian bridge, came down onto a highway, crushed some folks. We get called in on these things. So, I mean, that's the extreme, and that's mostly the structural engineers. But this is the type of work that our forensic team does at Thornton Tomasetti. So we're doing this at quite a high level. So that's the emergency response part of it. But in the architectural side of it is really, we go down 2 avenues. We go down what's called the litigation support side, which is attorneys hire us for this. I'm sorry, excuse me. I just wanted to check my time. So attorneys hire us when usually there's a litigation going on, and it could be something that failed in a building, it could be leaks in a building, it could be an architect is getting sued, it could be somebody wants to sue an architect, and we come in as the expert on cases like that, and I'm going to tell you much more about that. But the other side of it, and I want this specifically for the construction folks, the other side of it is the claims side of it. Insurance claims. Anybody here from the Panhandle of Florida? Okay. You involved with Hurricane Michael recently? Came through the Panhandle near Panama City? Well, did quite a lot of damage down there. Now, insurance companies don't know. They send out adjusters. The adjusters come in there and they look at all this damage, and they're a bit overwhelmed. They don't know what was wind damage, what was water damage, what needs to be replaced, what can be repaired. So Our forensic guys, engineers, architects, mechanical engineers, plumbing engineers, our whole team, we put a crew down there. We had dozens of people down there evaluating these buildings on behalf of insurance companies. Now for the construction guys, there's a whole slew of work that we work closely with. We don't do it in-house, but it's called construction consultants. All right? What these guys do, they're hired by the insurance company to ultimately figure out how much this damage is going to cost. We, the forensic architects and engineers, determine the scope. The adjusters determine what is basically insurable, what are they going to pay out, what does the policy say, but the construction consultants have a huge role in this. They have to determine what that damage cost. And not only the straight estimating stuff, say a building goes down, all right, destroyed, right down to the bottom, fire, it burnt to the ground. We can come in and say, as an architect, okay, the way insurance works is we will replace your building. We will replace exactly what you had with exactly the quality of what you had. That's generally what an insurance policy says without going into all the terms. But they don't want to give you any more. They don't want to give you gold-plated fixtures. So somebody has to oversee and make sure that what they're going to build back is exactly what they had. That's what they're entitled to. Now, inevitably, what comes up in a loss like that is, well, wait a minute, that building was built in the 1970s. They didn't have ADA back then, so now the building might need an elevator. Well, maybe that building wasn't sprinklered, but in today's codes, it has to be sprinklered. All of this adds cost and size to a building. And the construction consultants, we tell them about all of this stuff. They have to price in the new stuff. They have to determine the siting. How are they going to mobilize? Do they need cranes? So there's a whole slew of extra work that construction people do on behalf of insurance companies. And this is great work for you guys, for the construction team. So I wanted to point that out as a possible career path. They're called construction consultants. And there are several of them nationally that do this. I can give you the names of them if you want. But it's an interesting field, and they're always looking for people. It's very heavy in the estimating, if you like that, but there are other aspects to it as well. So I just wanted to point that out, that it's not only architecture that I'm here to talk about. I want to try to show you career paths for others as well. So I talked about what happens with an insurance claim, and I was once lecturing some of our people, trying to get them to understand how the insurance world works. And at the end of it, they said, we don't care about all this code stuff that you're pumping at us. We care about the sexy stuff. What happened in Florida? I said, it was great. There's no hotels. You go down there, there's no water. We can't get rental cars. So what do? We go to Airbnb, we rent a big house, and we put a dozen young architects and engineers in it, and they would go out every day, do their job, and come back at night, have a couple beers, and chat about their day. And everyone said, oh, that's what we love. That's cool. We travel to Florida and do all this. It's great. So that's kind of the fun part of it. We've been to earthquakes in New Zealand, and we would plant people in New Zealand for 6 or 8 months at a time. Imagine that. If you were young and single, wouldn't you want to go to New Zealand to work for 6 months? It's a great, great experience. It's hard work, but you're in the field, you're digging through, you're getting dirty. It's not clean work. But, I find it very interesting. And to some people, it's not appealing, but to others, I think that's a great opportunity. It's a very, very nice job to do, and it's well paid, you're respected, it's a good field. So, let me talk a little about litigation support, which is an area that is near and dear to my heart. Because I was a traditional architect for, like I said, the first 28 years of my career, I'm very well situated to offer opinion on what's called architectural standard of care. This is the rule that architects live by. It's called architectural standard of care. And what architectural standard of care means and is, it's basically, are you negligent in what you did? Did you do something that you shouldn't have, that another architect wouldn't have done? So really the terminology is what another prudent architect would do given similar set of circumstances in a similar location. Okay? So there's no black and white as to what standard of care is. But in many cases, if I'm working on the defense side of an architect, generally when there is a dispute in construction, the architect will always get dragged in. The reason being, he's got the errors and omissions insurance. So they'll always try to find a way to nail the architect and say, well, he didn't give me enough detail. My building leaks and he should have detailed that better. Or this code section he didn't follow. You know, they try to get the architect in because that's where the money is. And in construction claims and damages like this, a lot of times the contractors, they can get out of it. They can go bankrupt. They can, there's many avenues for them to avoid having to pay. But the architect, he's in there. It's really, really not a fun part of our field. So I'm often called in to defend other architects. Sometimes I have to go against other architects because if you want to be an expert, you have to do both sides of it. You can't just do defendant work, you have to do plaintiff work as well. So that's one of my special areas. And I'm going to show you a little case study that involved that. I'm hoping I'm not going over the time here. It's 1:45. So I think I better get right into it. I'm talking a lot here. So let me just whip through this a little bit so I can get into this. Okay, so I told you about the catastrophes. We had many catastrophes with Sandy. Sandy was a hurricane that hit the East Coast in 2012. We built a whole business on Sandy. We were involved in the World Trade Center when it came down. Thornton Tomasetti was. I talked about the I-35 bridge collapse. Anybody from Indiana? That area? Okay. A while back, there was a collapse of a stage. There was going to be a concert in a state fair, and there was a collapse of a stage that killed 7 people. We were involved in that, but I was going to go into it further, but I think I'm getting short on time. But I do want to talk about this practice as well, this resilience practice, because this came up very heavily after Sandy. Another avenue for architects and even the construction guys. This is hardening buildings from floods, earthquakes, things like that. You study it, you study the building, you find out their vulnerabilities from natural disasters, and you solve the problems. You help them solve the problems. You do studies, reports, and then implementation, and then you oversee the implementation of this. Another great field to consider. I wish I could go into it more, but it truly is a great field for us. Yeah, there's just more. Okay, I just want to touch base on our applied science guys. These are really the wild stuff that my company does. They basically work for the government and study what a blast would be to a submarine, what would happen to this building if a plane hits it, so the vulnerabilities and things like that, and then they design the fixes. So applied science is pretty cool, but it doesn't really employ architects. All right, so let me change gears here a little bit. I don't know what's going on here, folks, sorry. Uh-oh, I'm in trouble. I can't get a mouse. There we go, I got it. All right, I want to go through a case that I worked on. There were many aspects of this case, but I'm going to try to focus only on one aspect of it to try to keep it a little simple. I'm sorry, I don't have it in PowerPoint. I got kind of called away this week and wasn't able to finish my homework. So, the ultimate product that we put out as forensic folks is a report. And the report is very factual, is based on a lot of research. It has to be very well written. I took a course here called Technical Writing, another one of those courses that I never thought that I would use, but I'll tell you what, I rely on what I learned in technical writing to write these reports. It's been immensely helpful to me. I never thought I'd use that course. It was one of those English courses, but it was great. So this case involved an architect, and I was on the defense side of the architect. He was being sued. These are 21, there were two buildings. One was 21 stories, one was 22 stories. They were built around 1930. They were built as a hospital. They operated as a hospital. Now, I have a little affinity to the building because I was born there in this hospital. So it was in Jersey City, New Jersey. And these buildings they're historic buildings. They had a brick facade, beautiful Art Deco buildings. But the hospital ceased operation in the early 2000s, and a developer bought it and turned them into condo. And after the condos got sold, the building leaked like a sieve. So the architect gets sued, obviously, and this architect had $10 million worth of coverage, which is a lot. So they were coming at him from all angles. So I get a call, can you help us with this case? And I said, absolutely, I can help you with this case. So the buildings were steel structure. Again, think 1930s. Steel structure with concrete. They would pour the floors monolithically, and it would encase the steel beams. That was the fireproofing. The steel columns were encased in masonry, brick, and the exterior walls were mass brick walls, 4 widths of brick. Okay? Now, when they build mass brick wall, you're all familiar with a cavity wall, right? Well, they didn't use cavity wall back then. Cavity wall, the moisture, the rain sits on the wall. If it gets to the brick, goes down the back of the brick, weeps out, you're good. A mass brick wall doesn't work that way. A mass brick wall, they used good brick for the exterior of it, and the interior, this is 4 whites thick. The interior 3 whites are usually bricks that have been overfired or underfired. They're not the highest quality brick. And the theory behind it is when the moisture hits the wall, that it might get through 1 white, maybe 2 whites, maybe 3 whites, but it never gets to the backside of the 4th white. So the mass can hold enough water that it never gets to the inside of the building. Now, in the 1930s, they didn't have studs. They didn't use studs. They didn't use sheetrock. They had clay tile is what they would use. Clay tile is a material, a masonry material, that has hollow cores. It's put together like any other masonry material with mortar. And then they would plaster finish it. So all of the non-bearing partitions were these clay tile. Now this stuff deteriorates over time, and the building sat vacant for a long time. So the architect came in and said, he was responsible for the interior of the building. He said, take out all this clay tile. I need a clear palette to work from. Gut the building. So they do. Now, understand the clay tile was also faced the outside of the back side of the brick, and then they would put clay tile and leave a hollow spot. There's no insulation. That was kind of what they did to insulate. It was air. All right? Now, the contention on the other side, and I'm defending the architect here, another expert comes in and says, this building is leaking because the architect put metal stud wall, insulation, vapor barrier, sheetrock, and now that wall that used to get the heat from the building, we're in a cold climate, the heat from the building would get into that wall, would help to dry that wall. Because it's cold now and never gets warm, they claim that it's holding more water, and that's what's causing the water to come inside the building. I said, baloney. Okay? This is 4 whites of brick. That's not what's happening here. So we did a complete study of the exterior of this building. I'm going to show you some photos. And we found all the vulnerable points where water can get into this building and was getting into this building. So that was our role here. to come in, study this, determine what happened, and then argue our points. Now, there are many other facets of this, but that was our role, and I think we did it very successfully. We did a gigantic report. I'll show you some quick pictures. I think I'm running out of time. All right, so what we would do is we'd point out the cracks and say, look at this, bad sealant, cracks all over the place, the water's getting right in. So our point was to prove that water's getting through these walls regardless of whether that wall is filled with water or not. So, that's the kind of cases that we do. This one resulted in the insurance company paying almost $5 million. Only because they were glad they didn't have to pay $10 million. That's how it works in this business. Unfortunately, nobody comes out unscathed in a construction litigation case. So, I think I'm running out of time, but does anybody have any questions? Anything that I can answer for you? Yes, sir.
Whenever you first get a project like this, and they call you up and they're like, hey, here's the problem. What is your first step? You get the old set of plans, or you want to be on the field right off the bat?
Well, it depends on the situation, but generally, he asked, what is the first step to a litigation case? Generally, what we ask for are, let me see any reports by anybody else that's making the accusations. We want to see, in a construction case, there's a construction process. All right, the architect puts out a set of plans. Then they do value engineering. Big flag goes up, because that usually means they're cutting something out or changing something that the architect wanted gets cut out. Okay? So we follow that path. Then you go all through the construction path. You look at the plans, the specs, and then there's always the RFIs, the change orders. And it's a puzzle that you put together and try, you don't have all the pieces all the time. But you put this puzzle together of that construction process till you get to the end. And then you study meeting notes, because if you guys are going to be construction managers, you're going to have copious notes. And those notes will tell us what was discussed that day. And you'll find little snippets in little areas that say, yeah, somebody said we're going to change that detail because of this, that, or the other thing. Did they tell the architect? No. Okay, you just watch these paths of screw-ups that occur. And then you always want to go to the field. I never want to be in a position where I'm going to be a testifying expert and to say, I haven't been on that site. It's a very bad position to be in. So you want to go and look at the situation, assuming that it's still there. Okay? But generally the first step is to follow that construction path. Yes, sir?
How long did these processes normally take you from start to finish?
Okay, the question was, how long does this process take? Years. Okay? This project started, and I probably worked on it for 4 years. We spent many, many, many hours in the field, on scaffolds, doing probes in the exterior of the building. Every time I was on the defendant's side, every time the plaintiff in a case like this wanted to do testing, every defendant and their experts had to be there to observe it. And they were doing tons of testing on this building. The plaintiff's expert probably made $1 million on this case. He was there forever, squirting water and everything to try to figure out where these leaks were coming from. And we would watch him. It was great.
Who pays for that 4 years of work?
The question is, who pays for this work? Generally, the insurance companies pay for this work, and it's a lot of money. Now, on the plaintiff side, it's the condominium association, in this particular case, that was paying the plaintiff experts to do all this work. So they're investing all of this money, and the insurance companies are paying defendants experts, us, to defend against this. And this was over a $100 million case. These were big buildings. There were a lot of leaks. And if this was to go to court, it never did, it settled. But if this was to go to court, trying to get a jury to understand this technical stuff is extremely, extremely difficult, and they feel sorry. They would feel sorry for the occupants of the building because they bought a unit, paid $500,000 for a unit, and it leaks. You know what I mean? You can't dispute that. But the question is, why does it leak? Who did something wrong? And in this case, they didn't properly prepare the exterior of the building. There were too many voids. They should have been repointed everywhere. Every crack that was on the exterior of those buildings, you don't just smear sealant on it. That's not going to work. You don't just spray something on the brick. That only lasts temporarily. Okay? So you really needed to do it properly at first, and that's what they didn't do. Okay. That's all the time I got, folks. But I really appreciate you coming out to listen to me, and I'm really thrilled to be here. Thank you all very much.